Thank you, Eva. I imagine people are sick of me already, but I can assure you there won't be a word about blood libel tonight. Unless you want it, unless you have a question about it. But I'm very glad to be here and to speak to you this evening. This will be a journey beginning with the Babylonian Talmud and then extending to really the end of the 19th century. So it's obviously selective and a long journey, but I would like to begin with an urban renewal project in Prague, which took place over the first decade of the 20th century. When construction began on Prague's new city hall, Nová Radnice, on the eastern edge of Mariánské náměstí in 1908, the sculptor Ladislav Šalón was invited to adorn the two corners of the front entrance with statues of his own design. Šalón, you may know, is also the sculptor who designed and built the imposing monument to Jan Hus that dominates Old Town Square, Staroměstské náměstí, next door, and which was inaugurated in 1915 to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Hus's martyrdom. Now, no one who has visited Prague certainly has failed to see this impressive, dominating image. For the new city hall, Šalón chose images that he felt embodied the two districts of Prague that had been most deeply impacted, and some would say ruined, by the recently completed urban renewal project known as the Asanace. These were the Staré Město, the Altstadt, and Josefov or Josefstadt, Prague's Jewish quarter and former ghetto. For Staré Město, the old town, he chose a figure that represented the Iron Knight of medieval legend. For Jewish Prague, you may have seen this, he sculpted an expressionist image of the 16th century Rabbi Judah Löw ben Bezalel, whose dates are 1525 to 1609, known in Jewish culture by the acronym Maharal. Tall, with beard, earlocks or peyot, and flowing robe, along whose side clings a young woman, discordantly naked, clutching a flower. Šalón himself explained what he intended to convey in the work in a communication to the editors of the Prague Zionist publication Das Jüdische Prague in 1917. And this is what he wrote in translation. I could certainly have placed no better statue than that of the learned and mysterious Rabbi Löw, in whom everything of the finest quality that the old Prague ghetto had produced was embodied. Rabbi Löw was, to me, the symbol of the ghetto. And the figure of the young girl, freed from the oppressive bonds of all clothing, also held symbolic meaning for me. She presents her grandfather with a rose, from which death wafts towards him. For just as this beautiful child with her fragrant blossom brought about the end of Rabbi Löw, so too has the new free era, with the breath of her young life, involuntarily shattered the old relics of the past. It has also brought about the end of the Prague ghetto. That Szalon should have chosen to commemorate Prague's Jewish past through a permanent adornment to the new city hall, and specifically in the form of a statue to Maharal, suggests to me two things. First, that the centuries-long presence of Jews in Prague was acknowledged, at least by artists like Szalon, as central to the modern city's identity. Second, that popular legends surrounding the figure of Maharal, including one about his death, but also including what is perhaps the most famous one, that he was the creator of a golem, a living being made from earth and clay, were by this time, if not earlier, part of the lore of Christian as well as Jewish Prague. Ironically, however, although Szalon understood his sculpture to be a work of cultural retrieval, of collective memory, if you will, and although bookstalls in Prague offered publications in both German and Czech about Rabbi Löw and his golem, both the literary and the folkloristic motif of a golem attached to the person of the Maharal and the city of Prague are, in fact, products of the modern imagination. One searches in vain for any written records of such a pairing of person and place before the 19th century. Moreover, while Judah Löw ben Bezalel was a prolific writer and a scholar of great originality in his own time, there was nothing in his life to suggest that he dabbled in either magic or the Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition. And so we are left with questions. When and how does this association, this pairing of person and place begin, and how far back do tales of the golem creation go? Pretty far, it turns out, at least as far back as the Babylonian Talmud, which whose editing one would date to anywhere from the 4th to 7th century CE. Although the Hebrew word golmi is found in Psalms 139, where it's generally understood to mean my unformed limbs. The allusion here is to the creation of man, Adam, out of the most basic elements of nature. This reminds us that to make a golem is to engage in an audacious act of imitatio Dei. Is it then forbidden to try? Not necessarily, it seems. A narrative from the tractate Sanhedrin in the Babylonian Talmud reads as follows. Rava says, if the righteous wish to do so, they could create a world. As it is stated, quote, but for your iniquities have you been separated from your God. That's from Isaiah chapter 59. Indeed, Rava created a man. I'm continuing with the text. Rava created a man. Rava sent his creation before Rabbi Zerah. Rabbi Zerah would speak to him, but he, the creature, would not reply. Rabbi Zerah said to him, you were created by one of the sages. Return to your dust. This anecdote concerning Rava and his colleagues is embedded within a larger discussion, which sets forth permissible versus non-permissible forms of magic. It's apparent from the tone of the story, as well as from more explicit statements that follow, that the Talmud views the activities of the rabbis in question as being perfectly acceptable. Righteousness, one might infer, involves more than moral perfection. Ultimately, it constitutes both a striving for and an imitation of God, which for the truly righteous has no limits. The rabbis, it seems, have extended a sentiment found in Isaiah that human sinfulness erects a barrier between God and his creatures to suggest the obverse, that in the absence of sin, individuals can in fact become godlike, even to the extent of creating life. Apparently, however, even the most righteous would-be creatures of life suffered a major limitation to their art. Though their creatures could apparently understand the spoken word, they were denied the power of speech. Thus, when Rabbi Zera could not get Rava's creature to respond to him, he immediately suspected that it was in fact an artificial creation made by one of his colleagues and ordered it to, quote, return to the dust. The Golem motif has undergone a long and meandering evolution from antiquity to our own times, when the tale seems to speak of cybernetics and artificial intelligence, as we've just heard, while retaining strong elements of doom that hark back to Faust and to Frankenstein. The Book of Creation, Sefer Yetzirah, one of Judaism's earliest mystical texts, dating anywhere from the 3rd to the 6th century CE, proposes what it calls 32 paths of wisdom, unquote, consisting of combinations of the 10 basic numerals and the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Apparently, at least one modern scholar argues that Sefer Yetzirah is not merely a speculative work, but rather has as an underlying goal the actual creation of artificial life. While this claim may be a controversial one, it is clear that more than a few medieval Jews who read the work understood it in this practical light. In the early modern world, which is our real starting point this evening, developments take a curious turn. Jewish reports about the creation of life by pious individuals seem to originate from Poland, sometime in the early to mid-17th century. Moshe Idel, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, has discovered one example of this in the testimony of a Polish Kabbalist contained in a manuscript in the Oxford Library. But such information first became known to the world at large through the medium of print, thanks largely to the interest in Jewish ethnography and popular culture on the part of German Christian scholars, one of whom, Johann Christoph Wagenseil, I'll talk about in a moment. One of the earliest literary depictions of this theme comes to us in the form of a letter sent by Christoph Arnold to the Christian Hebraist Johann Christoph Wagenseil. He lived in the second half of the 17th century, and published by Wagenseil in 1674. In it, Arnold reports on what he claims to be the practice of golem building among Polish Jews. As told to him, apparently, the creator of the golem is said to be Rabbi Elijah of Chelm, who lived in the previous century, in the 16th century, who bore the epithet Baal Shem, meaning that he possessed secret knowledge of the holy names of God, and was remembered as someone adept in the arts of practical Kabbalah. In this telling, an important new motif is added. As Rabbi Elijah's creature is understood to be not only a servant who performs all sorts of physical labor for his master, but also a source of real or perceived danger. Let me read you parts then of Arnold's report with your acceptance, understanding. It's a little bit long. After saying certain prayers and holding certain fast days, they make the figure of a man from clay. And when they have said the Shem HaMeforash, the explicit and unmentionable name of God, over it, the image comes to life. And although the image itself cannot speak, so here you see the continuity of one important theme, it understands what is said to it and commanded. Among Polish Jews, it does all kinds of housework, but it's not allowed to leave the house. I know, not as sexy as protecting Jews from the blood libel, but that's another story. On the forehead of the image, they write emet, and that has 3 letters in Hebrew, aleph, mem, taf. That is truth. But a figure of this kind grows each day. Though very small at first, it ends by becoming larger than all those in the house. In order to take away his strength, which ultimately becomes a threat to all those in the house, they quickly erase the first letter, aleph, from the word emet on his forehead so that there remains only the 2 letters that spell out the word met, which means dead. When this is done, the golem collapses and dissolves into the clay or mud that he was. They say that a Baal Shem in Poland by the name of Rabbi Elias made a golem who became so large that the rabbi could no longer reach his forehead to erase the letter aleph or E. He thought up a trick, namely that the golem, being his servant, should remove his boots, supposing that when the golem bent over, he would erase the letter. And so it happened. But when the golem became mud again, his whole weight fell on the rabbi who was sitting on the bench and crushed him. As Moshe Idel rightly observes, the narrative connected to Rabbi Elijah Baal Shem in one form or another is the blueprint for the later, much more well-known legend of the creation of the golem by Rabbi Elijah's more famous contemporary, Rabbi Judah Löw. But exactly how this connection, this transposition of personalities remains elusive, despite several efforts in recent years to uncover the exact process, and that including my own efforts, I should add. Consider tonight a slight revision. Judah Löw's activity in Prague fell during the reigns of Habsburg Emperors Maximilian II and Rudolph II. Rudolph's dates are 1576 to 1612, a period which is sometimes referred to as the Golden Age of Czech Jewry. Maharal presided over one of Europe's great Talmudic academies, pioneered important reforms in Jewish education, and produced a large literary oeuvre that bestowed pride of place to Judaism's homiletical tradition, Agadah, or narrative. But, as I said earlier, no evidence suggests that he ever engaged in activities associated with the creation of a golem. While he does appear to have had an interest in the speculative side of Jewish mysticism, Judah Löw is not known for having been a devotee of the so-called practical Kabbalah. And unlike Elijah of Chelm, Judah Löw was not a Baal Shem. Nevertheless, as we shall see, virtually every literary evocation of the Golem legend since the first half of the 19th century incorporates 2 new elements. Judah Löw, the Maharal, is understood to be the Golem's creator, and Prague's Jewish town is portrayed as the locus of events. It's the Prague of Rudolph II, of course, that is recalled, the capital of one of Europe's most eccentric, cosmopolitan, and tolerant monarchs, patron of the arts and the occult sciences, supporter of the astronomers Johannes Kepler and Tycho de Brahe, and suspected Protestant sympathizer. One might speculate that the modern version of the Golem tale settled on Prague as the locus of events because of a general knowledge that it was there during the age of Rudolph that occult science and magic, humanistic pursuits, and textual study seem to have coexisted in a creative mix, the likes of which were rarely seen before. But what's the process by which this shift occurs? And who is responsible for it? Did this version of the story actually originate in Prague? And if so, did it constitute a piece of what you might call the local knowledge of Prague Jews, generated in Bohemia and recounted as a form of self-understanding? Or did both Jewish and Christian communities know and transmit the tale? Here's what we know, I think. As a motif, the Golem story appears to have jumped from folklore to ethnography and literature, and then back again. If this is true, then the locus of productivity may also, locus of production rather, may also have traveled, moving perhaps from Poland to Germany, and then from there to Bohemia and Prague. We've seen how Christian Hebraists and ethnographers provided literary form to Polish Jewish folk knowledge in the mid to late 17th century. Thereafter, it was the writer and folklorist Jakob Grimm who published a version of the Polish letter, in fact, a very close paraphrase of the Arnold Wagenseil report, in 1808 in his Journal for Hermits, Zeitung für Einsiedler. Grimm, like his early modern predecessors, was apparently unaware of any association of the Golem theme with the city of Prague or Rabbi Judah Löw, and this is 1808. So not the development we're looking for. Beginning in the 1830s, however, everything seems to change. And a flurry of publications appears, both literary and ethnographic, that now showcase Prague as the locus of the Golem tale and Maharal as the Golem's creator. Let's see, do I have a new one? Here we go. Ludwig August Frankl, whose dates are 1810 to 1894, a native of Bohemia who spent most of his life in Vienna, started the ball rolling with a brief entry in an Austrian journal for history and politics in 1836 under the collective heading Patriotic Tales and Legends, Vaterländische Sage und Legenden. Frankl situates the dramatic tension in the story, interestingly, in Prague's Altneuschule, Staronova Synagoga, in whose attic, he claims, quote, there is preserved in its primeval form and color a piece of trunk-like clay which is known by the name Golem. Let's see what he has to say. He writes, a wise rabbi, still called High Reb Löw by the Jews, who diligently occupied himself with the Kabbalah on every secret silent night, that's not true, formed a human-like figure and put a secret name, a Shem, of God under its tongue. Thus it was brought to life and performed the duties of a servant. But when the first 3 stars appeared in the sky of Friday evenings, and the shamus, the beetle, announced the Sabbath, the rabbi, because even the damned spirits, only the Lord creates a blessed one, are permitted to rest on the Sabbath, took the secret name of God from under his servant's tongue so that he became again a lifeless piece of clay. So here we have a different process. It's the name of God is placed on the tongue of the servant, not the word emet on the front. But both of these themes appear and reappear iconographically to the present day. Once, it is told, the rabbi suffered the pain of the loss of his beloved son and forgot to deanimate his servant when the beetle again proclaimed the peace of the Sabbath. Then this one, meaning the creature, was seized As if by madness, his eyes rolled and burned like flaming wheels. His breath was visible and sparkled with wonderful colors, and he began a terrible destruction in the house. Everyone was very terrified and cried with anxious horror for the rabbi. However, he was not in any condition to restrain the creature in order to take the secret name from under his tongue. So he spoke a deep-cutting curse, and the servant became again what it was before, a piece of clay. The rabbi never dared again to practice the secret science. So let me just review a couple of points now. We have the theme of the creature going out of control and being destructive, but it's Friday evening, the eve of the Sabbath, and apparently the body of the crumpled body of the Golem is to be found in the attic of the Altneuschule. Shortly after Frankel's tale appeared, and too soon, I think, to have been influenced by it, the German Jewish writer Bertolt Auerbach published the first edition of his novel, Spinoza, which included the retelling by a young Baruch Spinoza of a story that he had heard, so he says, from a servant in the Spinoza household, a Jewish woman from Germany. This is important because Spinoza, being Dutch, living in Amsterdam, of course, is very rational and sophisticated, but the German Jewish woman who is his servant is obviously more susceptible to suggestion. And Spinoza is said to say the following: "In my father's house, we have an old servant named Chaya. She is German and is full of legends and superstitions of the German Jews. She once explained to me why at Prague, on Friday evening, interesting, they sing the hymn twice over by which Israel is united in mystical bonds of matrimony to the Sabbath." Keep that in mind. So, once upon a time, a great Kabbalist lived in Prague called the Rabbi Löw. He made a human figure of clay and left a small aperture in the lesser brain, the cerebellum, if you will, in which he laid a parchment with the unutterable name of God written on it. The clod immediately arose and was a man. He performed all the duties of a servant for his creator. He fetched water and hewed wood. All through the Jews' quarter, he was known as the Golem of the great Rabbi Löw. Every Friday evening, the rabbi took the parchment out of his head, and he was clay until Sunday morning. Once the rabbi forgot this duty. All were in the synagogue, and the Sabbath hymn was begun when all the women and children in the assembly started and screamed out, the Golem is destroying everything." The rabbi ordered the precentor, the chazan, to pause at the end of the prayer. Stop. It was yet possible to save all, but later naught would avail. The whole world would be destroyed. He hastened home and saw the Golem already seizing the joists of his house to tear down the building. He sprang forward, took the parchment out, and dead clay again lay at his feet. From that day, another thing to take notice of, from that day they sang the Sabbath bridal song twice in Prague. The great Rabbi Löw certainly never thought of Descartes, and yet his Golem had as much life as any man. If we are to accept the new view, must be Cartesian, that the union between soul and body is so slight that at any moment it can be disjoined and again reunited, unquote. All right. Well, it's noteworthy that both narratives have Prague's Altneuschule as the locus of events, although each one points to a different practice or mystery associated with the synagogue. Frankel's rendition alludes to the popular claim that the crumpled clay body of the golem resides in the attic of the shul under the roof, but also that no one dares to climb up to view it. Auerbach's story, in my view the more interesting of the two, is structured around the custom in the Altneuschule of repeating Psalm 92, a song for the Sabbath day, and what follows, Psalm 93, the Lord is King, before the Chazan chants the formal call to prayer, the Baruch Hu. By the way, a custom, I should say, by the way, that is practiced to this day. So if you go to the Altneuschule on Friday night, they repeat Psalms 92 and 93 and then say the Baruch Hu. So it's practiced to this day, although Chaya, the family servant, apparently identifies the repeated prayer as L'cha Dodi, Come My Beloved, composed by the 16th century mystic Shlomo Alkabetz. It's not L'cha Dodi that they repeat. While both versions understand the purpose of the creature to perform the duties of a servant, which the golem dutifully completes 6 days of the week, the threat of danger and destruction lurks should Rabbi Löw forget, for whatever reason, to incapacitate his creature before the start of the Sabbath. And so the two tales are so distinctively vocal in their Prague context, the centrality of the Altneuschule, the figure of Maharal, the conflict between creative work and Shabbat's command to restrain from creation, and the underlying potential for death and destruction in the golem itself, that I find it unlikely that they were influenced by the German literary cum ethnographic documents of the late 17th and early 19th century, despite scholarly claims to the contrary. I think you have to look to, in other words, I think you have to look to Prague, Jewish, and maybe Christian folklore, in situ, in place. Problem with folklore is it's not the same as literary text, and it's hard to isolate. Okay, so Frankel and Auerbach are communicating something else, something they know from oral Jewish sources. One wonders if they are hearing the same folk tales, and if both versions can be called authentic, if you will. That is to say, do they both stem from local Prague Jewish traditions? It's true that Frankel was a Czech, German, and Hebrew-speaking Bohemian Jew, born in Hrast and educated largely in Prague, where some of his siblings continued to make their home. Did his Bohemian origins then place him closer than Auerbach to Prague Jewish traditions? Perhaps, but I hesitate to give his tale pride of place. I am impressed by the specificity of Auerbach's story and its closeness to popular Jewish culture in Prague today. And again, while I don't have a solid answer to the question of sources, written or oral, upon which the two individuals drew, I doubt that Auerbach was transmitting early modern German ethnography about Jews. Rather, his story, too, may well come from Jewish Bohemia. Perhaps the picture would be clearer if we performed two small operations on the text. Is that allowed? Well, let's try it. Instead of the historical Spinoza, let's understand the narrator of the tale to be Auerbach himself. This, in other words, was something that he had heard in a family setting. And let's have Chaya, the original conveyor of the information, stem not from Germany, but from, apologies, backward Bohemia. She may have been, in fact, in his family history, a Bohemian Jewish domestic who worked for the family. What was clearly an ethnographic treasure hunt for orally transmitted Prague Jewish traditions gathers considerable steam now in 1841, indeed in the early 1840s. 1841 is the year in which the non-Jewish journalist and folklorist Franz Kluczak published his story, Der Golem, misspelled, des Rabbi Löw, in a Prague monthly that was called Panorama des Universums and was devoted to the investigation of world cultures. 6 years later, in 1847, now I can move a little bit. 6 years later, in 1847, a Jewish physician by the name of Leopold Weisel, who grew up and lived most of his life near the town of Domažlice in southwestern Bohemia, and worked at the same time as a kind of partner in arms to Franz Kluczak, whom I just mentioned, published a collection of tales which he called Sagen der Prager Juden, sayings of Prague Jews, in the immensely popular anthology Sipurim, or Sipurim, to use the Ashkenazi pronunciation, Sipurim, eine Sammlung jüdischer Volkssagen, published by Wolf Paschalus, and it had editions that stretched from 1847 all the way to the 20th century and into the 20th century. Among the 5 stories retold here by Weisel is his own version of the Golem legend, a minor classic of brief fiction and the benchmark for subsequent retellings down to the eve of the First World War. Weisel's literary career is testimony to the fact that the self-conscious recovery of oral traditions is a decidedly modern act in which secular intellectuals, in the throes of social and cultural change, seek to save something of the traditional society that is fast slipping away forever. He acquired his medical education in Prague, probably from about 1824 to 1830, during which time he lived in the old Jewish town and supported himself as a private tutor for a number of Jewish families. Sensing that he stood at a historical turning point, he took it upon himself to capture the rich folk traditions of the ghetto, apparently by interviewing older residents and recording their stories. Now, Kluczak's and Weisel's renditions of the Golem tradition were published only 6 years apart, yet they build upon rather different narratives. Interestingly, Kluczak's, who is not Jewish, by the way, Kluczak's is the longer and more elaborate of the two, written with an eye for descriptive detail in lyrical German prose. The tale is offered as an example of authentic Prague Jewish tradition, and it does appear that the storyteller has his informants within the Prague Jewish community. Der Golem is also remarkable for the completeness with which it accounts for circumstances and motivations in the Golem narrative. Kluczak offers a compelling explanation, for example, for the Faustian element of power run amok, which occupies a central position in all modern versions of the Prague account. With one foot in the practical Kabbalah and the other in popular psychology, he writes that, quote, "Fortunately, the Golem was not aware of his magic powers," unquote, and that Rabbi Löw was able to devise ways to keep his creature under control. Similarly, Kluczak's narrative accounts for Rabbi Löw's absence from the synagogue on that critical Friday evening, the reason for the rabbi's ordering first the stopping and then the repetition of Psalm 92, and the fact that the Shabbat had not yet officially begun. Relying once again on one layer of Jewish folk tradition to explain another, Kluchak has the cantor urging an early start to the Friday evening service so that the souls in purgatory might cool themselves off in the brooks and streams whose enjoyment was prohibited to Jews on the Sabbath day. Attending to a sick and dying daughter, Rabbi Löw has decided not to pray with the community that evening, but was brought running to the synagogue when the cries of people watching the Golem start to tear apart the building reminded the rabbi of his failure to provide the Golem with a new talisman. The reason for the violence lay in the simple fact of consciousness. The creature was becoming aware of his own power. By the time the Maharal arrives at the Altneu Shul, the Golem is tearing at its walls. The doors to the Holy Ark, which Kluchak knows and makes certain that his readers know that he knows, rested in the eastern wall of the Altneu Shul. The doors have fallen off. The candelabrum has fallen to the ground so that all is darkness, quote, as though the end of the world were approaching, unquote. At this point, practicality reigns. The Maharal orders the prayers halted so that he can put the proper talisman in the mouth of the Golem. Once peace is restored and the candles rekindled, which can only be done on a weekday, so it's a good thing they didn't they get to the Baruch Hu, the Jews, quote, laud the wisdom of Rabbi Löw, who has saved them from destruction, and pray more ardently than ever the so-called, what he calls the first psalm and the Sabbath prayers. They send a prayer to Jehovah with such fervor for the recovery of the great rabbi's daughter that Jehovah, you can tell he wasn't a Jewish writer, that Jehovah calls upon the angel of death, which he calls the Malach HaMavod, close, right? Whom he already has sent to the rabbi's house to return. This is an interesting thought, right? That one of the suggested powers of Maharal is that he knew how to evade the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death. That's why he lived so long. Though spare and somewhat impoverished compared to Kluchak's tale, Weisel's Der Golem is the better known of the two and appears to have served as a basis for subsequent borrowings. For all its brevity, the author does provide a few bits of extraneous information which afford the reader a small window onto his self-conceived ethnographic mission. When he writes in a brief introduction to Sagen der Prager Juden that, quote, countless tales are attached to the old synagogues and the narrow streets, and nearly every tombstone in the large old cemetery offers up material to one tale or another, unquote. At the same time, he assures the reader that he transcribed the stories as he heard them, quote, from the mouth of the old, unquote, thus attesting to his reliability as a transcriber of folk traditions. Weisel also introduces his story with a tantalizing aside in which he excuses its brevity with the observation that this, quote, popular tale has already been used by various writers. Quote, it seems superfluous to me to rework such a well-known story. I shall present it briefly, lest one think that I did not know it. So he thought, in a sense, it wasn't even worth his time because everybody knew the Golem tale. Remember, so this is now 1847. Weisel clearly means to indicate that this particular Golem story enjoyed wide circulation in his day, both as a piece of literature and as a tale told by the Jews of Prague. He hardly deemed it worthy of reproducing because it already was widely acknowledged as belonging to the folkloristic treasury of Jewish Prague. Okay, I'm going to try to arrive at a kind of conclusion. Maybe we'll call it an epilogue. By the time Ladislav Shalon received his commission from the city fathers, to place statuary in front of the new city hall invoking old Prague. He actually had numerous Czech writings at his disposal dedicated to Jewish history and folklore. These works included Josef Jiří Kollár's popular play Pražský Žid, The Prague Jew, 1871, which was set in 1620, the time of White Mountain, in which the Jewish Eliav donates money to the defeated Czech cause and refuses to flee his homeland. Also, Jaroslav Verchlitsky. Verchlitsky is a pseudonym of Emil Frida, whose dates are 1853 to 1912. Verchlitsky's play Rabbinska Moudrost, Rabbinic Wisdom, a comedy in 3 acts. That was from 1886. Did he mean that? You know, he did kind of, because it was a comedy, yeah. In which the main character is none other than Rabbi Judah Löw, although there's no discussion in it of the creation of a golem. So it's other wisdom, or so-called wisdom. There's Verchlitsky's 400-page epic poem Bar Kochba, 1897. And by the way, the Prague student Zionists in those last years of the 19th century took from this play and what it suggested about Jewish national resistance as the name of their organization, Bar Kochba. So Bar Kochba, in which the plight of the Jews under Roman domination and oppression of the oppression of the Czech nation in modern times are implicitly equated. He also had a Samson trilogy, 1901. There is Alois Jidásek, Staré pověsti české, 1894, which includes a subsection, Prague's Jewish Town. None of these works, however, narrates the long evaded death of the Maharal. What then provided Shalom's inspiration? The answer, I think, is to be found in a different work of Verchlitsky's, his poem První růže, the first rose, which appeared in his 1876 collection Epické básně, epic poems. And Epické básně has been reprinted forever, down to today, but often in a variety of sizes and versions and selections. So it's called The First Rose. Let's return to our statue. Many of the elusive elements of Czech and Jewish folklore regarding Judah Löw find voice in its verses, starting with his long lifespan and his supposedly magical powers. So if you will allow a little bit of Czech in bad accent. 100 let byl už rabín Leví starý, tělem chorý, duchem ale jarý, ve svatých knihách čítal dnem i noci, ba i tajná kouzla měl ve své moci. Rabbi Levi was already 100 years old, frail in body but lively in spirit. He read in the holy books day and night, and even had magic in his power. Next, the rabbi's amazing talent at circumventing death when it beckoned. The universe, the sky, and even all eternity, he penetrated with a pious soul, a bold mind. Twice death came, but what fears? The rabbi played chess with it victoriously. The climactic meeting which Judah Löw fails to evade, finally. The new spring came with flowers, songs. How many times even the rabbi does not know. Night after night, awake in hard work, he is still lost in his thoughts in the morning. At that moment, his dear granddaughter, that's the naked woman beside him, his dear granddaughter approaches him quietly with the step of a doe, stroking with her child's tender hand the wrinkles of his forehead and that snowy chin. I plucked the first rose for you, which bloomed in the beautiful spring. The first of the flowers is the white rose, which spring has already conjured up for us this year. And finally, our rabbi's final moments, entered into with both resignation and love. How so? What are you saying, dear daughter? And reaches for it with his old hand. Rose, and once again bows his head in sweet remembrance of youth. Dej sem růží, snad svou tužbu skojím, už růží tiskne keretum svojím. Div, že do ní nevydechne duší, ale běda pozdě zrádu tuší. Give me the rose. Perhaps I will satisfy my desire. And he presses the rose to his lips. It's a wonder that he does not breathe his soul into it, but alas, he senses the betrayal too late. He no longer raises his gray head, his eye fades, and his face turns pale as soon as he lowers his hand to the child and whispers a blessing with his weak lips. Thank you. So that poem moves me. I don't know why. But another element that you might notice is how tall Rabbi Löw is in this statue. And that also refers to some folklore, because he was known in German Jewish or Western Yiddish as Der Hohe Rabbi Löw, which means the great or high rabbi, but it's a play on words because it can also mean tall, exceedingly tall. So he was very tall, and he lived for an awfully long time until he took that rose. So, anyway, I'm very happy to take questions if you have some. Yes. Can you stand that, and then people can. Oh, we have a microphone.
Yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that because I learned something I didn't know before. I'm always a sponge for any kind of information. My question revolves around you're tracing the Golem from the Babylonian era to the early modern era. You skipped the Haskalah. Was there anything going on with the Golem during that period?
Thank you. Was the Jewish and did writers and activists in the Jewish Enlightenment, known as the Haskalah, have something to say about the Golem? I don't think so, and I venture to add that they probably would not have found such mystical tales attractive. So that wasn't what they were trying to push. Yeah.
Thank you. The word golem, does it mean anything? Is that coming from somewhere?
So there is the word golem doesn't mean anything. As I mentioned very early on, there is one biblical reference, golmi, my something, my form, my unformed form. So whether it's originally from Hebrew or borrowed from another Middle Eastern language, I'm not sure. And it has something to do with form. But you know, the first questioner with form, and hence the association with the biblical narrative of the creation of Adam out of earth, right, out of dust or earth and clay. And so, but you know, our first question used the proper Yiddish pronunciation, Golem. And a Golem, by the way, a Golem in popular Yiddish speech is someone who what? An idiot, or someone who can't speak. So someone who's dumb in both senses, can't speak and is essentially dumb. And so you can see how that comes actually out of folklore that was known, that the one thing we know about golems is that they do not have the power of speech. And for all we know, they're dumb, right? They can sort of understand you. And that then is part of modern Yiddish. Yeah.
Homer Golem is in modern Hebrew.
Homer Golem. Now,
It's a raw material.
but you think, but that may come from the word golem and not the reverse, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Homer Golem. Thank you. Yeah. Others? Yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. The golem is sometimes interpreted as expressing the Jewish ambivalence toward the necessity of worldly power and force. We need this physical power to protect ourselves, but there's a risk that it will go out of control. With that in mind, do you know anything about how the legend of the golem has been interpreted by Israeli writers and received in Israeli culture?
Yeah, I wish I did. How that? Well, we know that there's some ambivalence in almost all iterations of the golem tale, and maybe that's one of the things that makes it so attractive to us. It's imperfect, right? The creators are imperfect. The golem itself has limitations as well as tremendous powers, and the consequences of the creation of the golem can be disastrous, right? That's built in to the narrative. And and so I have to say, I'm just not expert in 20th century Israeli adaptations of the story, but by the time we get to the third lecture, maybe, but it's really worth looking at. In other words, Israeli writers may ask whether Israelis themselves have created a golem out of the national movement. I'm sure that theme comes up, right? And how does one tame it? Like, what's the method? How do you erase the aleph without ending up with met? Yeah. That would be bad, right? How do you take the petek of paper with the Shem HaMefrosh on? I don't know. Yeah, and but you know, and it's not just contemporary Israel, but in the Frankenstein story too, right? And I think that Shelley, there are literary scholars who suggest that Shelley is really drawing on consciously drawing on the golem tale in the Frankenstein narrative. Yeah, is the golem also ultimately well-meaning and mild in disposition? I don't know. Apparently, in Wegener's film, the very end suggests that once he leaves the ghetto, in other words, no more Jewish influence, and can be surrounded by beautiful blonde women, girls, he's calm and restful and smiling. So I don't know, right?
It's understandable.
But Frankenstein too, you know, is in some of the film versions has a real gentle side to him as well, right? Yeah. And I'm also thinking of Young Frankenstein, great movie, very Jewish, I'm sure. And,
Put the candle back.
So. And there's one in the back row.
Yes. Thank you. Sorry in advance. I'm kind of terrible at microphones, so let me know if I'm echoing. I was really curious towards the end, this idea of him playing chess to stave off death, and I was particularly interested in how that kind of played in this literary tradition of possibly trying to make the golem seem archaic, because I know in the Maharal, because I know in a lot of medieval narratives, that's actually a very common finale to a kind of knightly romance story of, instead of that, they're just going to end with a chess match, and it's kind of a wit-based thing. So I was curious how much you thought that was based on, where that kind of fit into this idea of them placing that in the idea of the past, and kind of where that fit in the literary criticism of the Golem, and what other stories it might be borrowing from as well to create a narrative.
And I may not have been totally clear. In this poem, Verchlitsky is suggesting that it's Rabbi Löw who plays chess with death, right? And so that really fits with the idea that this is how a clever person who's also brave is able to counter, to evade death. Yes, and also we have one in the front row. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, from the Israeli point of view, to address your question, not so much about the literature, but our understanding, as you suggested, was it's a mindless form. It's a mindless Golem, the chomer, mindless matter.
Material or matter. Yeah.
Matter.
Yeah.
So, and that is contrasted with the brilliance of the rabbi.
Yeah.
And if you think of the, so to speak, what you were talking about, your allusion to the current power being mindless, I think that would be offensive to many. In fact, at least the image that's projected is that it's very mindful and very planned. I'm just adding it to reflect.
That gets to the heart of a debate, of course.
Exactly.
Right.
I'm adding as a reflection, not even as an opinion. So.
Yeah. Thank you. We have another.
There was a very famous play written in the 20s by H. Levik, Yiddish poet, the Golem, and I think Habima produced it also in Moscow. So in this version of Golem's story, he was built by the rabbi for protecting Jews because they were expecting pogrom. So it was really not as a servant to wash the floors or do the dishes, but really to protect Jewish population of Prague. And what happened that later on he was kind of becoming more and more aggressive. And the rabbi was afraid that that he was paying too much attention to his granddaughter, the one with the rose. So, but the idea of somebody that was built for protection, for doing good, becoming violent. And I think in this case, it really, the power makes, takes very violent moves. And in this, maybe we can see this kind of connected.
Right, this theme of the Golem as protector against anti-Semitic violence. You'll hear more about this in Professor Robinson's lecture in October. I'll just state a few points about it. So Levik is basing his theme on Yudel Rosenberg's Sefer Niflaot Maharal, which also had a Yiddish version. And this was produced in 1909, or it was published in 1909, and the claim was that it was discovered in a manuscript in a library in Metz, France. But in fact, it was penned by Rosenberg himself, and that's important. 1909 was not even 10 years after the Hilsner ritual murder trial of 1899 to 1901. And when there were riots against Jews, and when there were accusations of Jewish ritual murder, and where the accused was actually, unlike some other accused at the turn of the 20th century, Leopold Hilsner was found guilty, not innocent, and sentenced to death. And then the case was retried the next year in Písek in southern Bohemia, because the High Court in Vienna said, this is just ridiculous, you have to retry it. And he was convicted a second time and sentenced to death a second time. Ultimately, he was released. But what I'm trying to say is that, interestingly, in the Middle Ages and the early modern world, Prague Jews did not see themselves as under threat. And the threat of anti-Semitism never makes its way into this pre-modern Golem tale. It's only in the 20th century, which is really responding to modern developments, believe it or not, that's when that becomes the dominant motif. And you'll hear more about that. One more?
I mean, perhaps I don't remember well, but after the reign of Rudolph II, which was a golden age, weren't Jews expelled from Prague?
Weren't Jews expelled from Prague during the reign of Maria Theresa in the 18th century? Yes, for about 8 years, and then brought back. And interesting, one of the reasons they were brought back is because her nobility said, this is ridiculous. we need the wealth from Jewish taxation. We need Jewish productivity, et cetera. You have to bring them back. But yes, but with two minor exceptions, this was unusual for the pre-modern world. With two temporary exceptions, Jews were never expelled from Prague from the High Middle Ages to 1939. It's unusual, it's atypical. There are a number of reasons for it. One of which was that it was not just a city, but it was an imperial city. It was part of the imperial patrimony. So the imperial house normally protected Jews. Yeah. One more.